Hello there, wake up, it's Means Morning News. Just after 11 a.m. on the East Coast, and this is That Friday Show, and I'm that newsman, and you're that audience. We all have our roles to play this morning, so let's get started. And we begin in Washington, where lawmakers today are expected to take up a $1.2 trillion budget bill that will avoid a government shutdown this weekend and keep agencies funded through September. The legislation was a result of bipartisan negotiations on Capitol Hill, and if there's one thing both parties can agree on these days, it's inflicting punishment on the Palestinian people. Because the bill contains a provision that cuts off U.S. funding to a critical Palestinian relief organization. That's right, the spending bill keeps in place the suspension of U.S. funding for the UN Relief and Works Agency in Gaza, also known as UNRWA. It's the largest aid group operating in Gaza, and it's critical to the survival of the more than 2 million people living in the enclave. Now, this all dates back to January when, on the same day that the International Court of Justice found it plausible that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza, the Netanyahu government released a report claiming that members of UNRWA were also part of Hamas and took part in the October 7th uprising. This led to the U.S. and several other Western countries to immediately cut off funding for UNRWA. Now, it was later revealed that the Israelis didn't actually have any evidence for this claim, and that this was all likely a manufactured lie to distract from the ICJ proceedings. Even if the claims were true, and again, there's no indication they actually are, they still only applied to about a dozen UNRWA staffers, which is a tiny fraction of UNRWA's workforce of tens of thousands of people in Gaza. Realizing that the Israeli allegations were bogus, several entities have since resumed funding to UNRWA, including Australia, Canada, Sweden, and the European Union. But the U.S., which was previously UNRWA's largest donor, is now trying to codify its termination of funding to the relief agency, just as Palestinians are suffering from a famine induced by the Israeli military. Here was Senator Bernie Sanders speaking out against the measure this week.
The Israeli government and its allies like AIPAC spend much of their time lobbying to defund UNRWA, the major organization which is feeding starving people. Sadly, tragically, many members of Congress seem to be happy to be part of this Starvation Caucus, happy to cut funding for UNRWA and make it harder to get aid to Palestinians in the midst of this crisis.
Sanders' colleague, Senator Chris Van Hollen, said in a statement, quote, "To punish over 2 million innocent people in Gaza and UNRWA beneficiaries throughout the region for these actions is not just misguided, it's unconscionable. I call on the administration to immediately release current funding to UNRWA, as the EU, Canada, and others have done, in order to help prevent the famine that now sits at Gaza's doorstep." House Democrat Ro Khanna said he would vote no on the spending bill if it contained the UNRWA funding ban. But for now, it appears that the Starvation Caucus has enough votes to pass this damn thing. Meanwhile, Axios reported that Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant is coming to Washington next week with a, quote, weapons wish list. Gallant was one of many military and government officials to be directly accused of inciting genocide during South Africa's case against Israel before the International Court of Justice earlier this year. He's referred to Palestinians as animals. Now, an Israeli official coming to the U.S. to ask for more weapons sure does look like a point of leverage the Biden administration could use to influence Israel, despite the administration claiming for months that it has no such leverage. The most correct course of action here would be for Gallant to be arrested and turned over to The Hague. But at a minimum, Biden should tell Gallant to go fuck himself and say there will be no more weapons going to Israel. Until then, the White House remains 100% complicit in crimes against humanity. New data confirms that a union job is still the best kind of job. The progressive think tank, the Center for American Progress, reviewed numbers from the Federal Reserve's latest survey of consumer finances, which covered the year 2022. And here's what it found. First, the median wealth in union households is 1.7 times higher than in non-union households. As this chart shows, that translates to median wealth of over $338,000 in union homes compared to less than $200,000 in non-union ones. The home ownership rate was also higher among union households, 70% to 65%, and a much larger percentage of union workers have a retirement plan, including a defined benefit one, compared to the non-unionized. Also, union jobs are found to close the wealth gap between white and minority workers and between college-educated and non-college-educated workers. So by virtually every measure, you remain better off in a union job. And that was especially true in 2023. According to a report from Bloomberg, new union contracts negotiated last year resulted in first-year wage increases of more than 6.5%. That's a record bump since Bloomberg started tracking the data. Add in contract signing bonuses and other lump payments included in those contracts, and wages actually rose more than 7%, which, as you can see from this chart, is the highest recorded, and builds on a boost in wages from 2022 as well. Bloomberg gathered its data from a review of more than 950 union contracts that cover about 2.8 million workers. And it's impressive that organized labor was able to achieve these gains given the institutional headwinds it faces, not just union busting, but technocratic tweaks at the Federal Reserve that were aimed specifically at weakening labor power. Never underestimate the power of a union. The Government Accountability Office reviewed plans put forward by the Pentagon to reduce civilian casualties. And there are a couple red flags here. This all pertains to what's known as the Civilian Harm Mitigation and Response Action Plan, which the DoD set up in 2022. In response, it claimed to media reports of high civilian deaths from U.S. operations around the world. This action plan was informed by a number of studies into civilian casualties, and it laid out 11 objectives that included things like setting up a workforce dedicated to civilian harm reduction, establishing measures to avoid target misidentification, and creating more robust civilian reporting mechanisms. Now, let's put aside just how seriously DoD is taking this, or if this is just a branding exercise for a war machine that has devoured civilian lives around the world for almost a century. But there are two things in this GAO report that immediately stand out. First, some military officials don't think the action plan applies to cyber warfare, also known as non-kinetic operations. Quote, OUSD and U.S. Africa Command officials characterized multiple examples of operations and cyber activities that they were unsure how to apply the action plan to, examples of activities that could adversely affect civilian populations. This would seem to be a massive loophole in the civilian death mitigation plan, given just how destructive cyber operations can be. They aren't just phishing emails. Cyber attacks can cripple entire cities, shutting down utilities, or even worse, causing dams and power plants to malfunction. For example, the Stuxnet computer virus, which was developed by the US and Israel and deployed against the Iranian nuclear program, had the ability to cause physical destruction to centrifuges. So the potential for civilian harm here is substantial, especially in future conflicts. GAO recommended that the Defense Department clarify down the chain of command how to respond to potential civilian death in non-kinetic operations, and the Pentagon responded by saying it will look into the matter. Another thing that stood out in this report is that some military officials don't seem to think that the action plan applies to major war scenarios either. Check out this from GAO. Quote, An official from U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, a combatant command that is preparing for a potential large-scale conflict with China, said that the reaction to the action plan was that civilian harm mitigation and response is more appropriate for counterterrorism or counterinsurgency and irrelevant for large-scale conflicts. For example, one official wondered how to avoid mistaken target identification for each strike if there are hundreds of thousands of strikes in a large-scale, high-intensity conflict. Yikes. Who is that interviewed official? Curtis LeMay? One would hope the U.S. military had grown more ethical since the days of World War II when it was wiping entire cities off the map with firebombing campaigns. This, however, would suggest otherwise. It's the day of the week that the oligarchy fears the most. It's time for Rich Dicks. Thanks for all the nominations on social media, from Genocide Joe to Jared Kushner to Dana White to Michael Rappaport to Jeffrey Yass. And of course, how could I forget about Arona, who nominated all the goddamn landlords. All very deserving nominations. And in the end, this week's Rich Dick is Lyanna Parker. Who's she? She's a landlord. You're welcome, Arona. In fact, Parker is such a bad landlord that the freaking Environmental Protection Agency has now intervened to protect her tenants. This is all going down in Putnam, Connecticut at the old Cargill Falls Mill, which was converted into residential apartments back in 2020. A couple of years later, the local health department investigated a young girl's lead exposure in the building and subsequently found that the place was riddled with lead-contaminated paint and dust. The tenants say they weren't given proper documentation about the lead risks before moving in, which is against the law. And as they've struggled to get testing and remediation to deal with the lead problem, Lyanna Parker, who owns the building, has been completely unresponsive, doesn't return tenants' calls, doesn't respond to media requests, and has actually tried to intimidate tenants seeking relief and try to force them to leave. The management company that oversees the building has taken some steps to clean out common areas with lead exposure, but not thoroughly enough. Local public health agencies have also largely failed to protect tenants whose apartments haven't directly received abatement orders. So, in the midst of this struggle, residents organized. They formed the Cargill Tenants Union, and in January, the union laid out grievances when it announced a rent strike. These grievances read like a rap sheet against a truly nightmare landlord. Quote, grievances against the management company Conover Residential and landlord Parker include uncontrolled pests, mold, moisture damage, active leaking, trip hazards, hiring of unsafe contractors, structural decay, toxic levels of lead dust, chronic potholes and related car damage, upper respiratory illnesses, lead poisoning, verbal abuse by the property manager, racial discrimination, and a lack of oversight leading to theft and damages to tenants' property. All right, but other than all that stuff, how is everything, huh? How's the view? Thanks to the union making enough noise about what's happening, Parker and the people she's paid to manage her leaded property have now caught the attention of the state and federal government. Earlier this month, the Connecticut Attorney General's office got involved and announced an investigation into the lead contamination. In a letter to Lyanna Parker, the AG noted how her company received millions of dollars in government funding to finance the renovation project at the mill to turn it into housing that meets environmental standards. From the letter, quote, these complaints call into question Cargill Falls Mill's compliance with these requirements. Yeah, I'd say someone is walking around with a big chunk of money in their pocket that was supposed to go toward making sure the apartments weren't poisonous. Well, this week, the EPA took up the case. The agency ordered Parker's company, Historic Cargill Falls Mill LLC, to take immediate steps to abate lead contamination in the building. The agency also ordered the landlord to arrange and pay for tenants to live somewhere else during the cleanup process and to conduct testing for the next 5 years just to make sure the place isn't still contaminated. The tenant union responded to these new developments on Twitter, saying, quote, "Today, the EPA announced they are issuing an administrative order against our landlord. Every development towards enforcement and tenants' protection has been directly won by our tenant union and the risk we took to go on rent strike." The union is right, but it shouldn't have had to take this much of a struggle just to ensure people's homes aren't poisoned and kids aren't getting sick. Landlords, they're the fucking worst. Solidarity with the Cargill Tenants Union. Lyanna Parker, you are this week's Rich Dick. Okay, friends, the show ends this morning with a sunrise from Massachusetts. It was sent in by Brendan in Brookfield. Enjoy. Thank you, Brendan. Show's over. Thanks for watching, and thanks to the team behind the scenes. Please sign up for Means TV if you haven't yet, and subscribe to our YouTube and podcast channels, and follow us on social media. One day capitalism will fall. Till then, we're going to be right here. See you next week.